Thank you to Critical University Studies Working Group and the History Department for co-sponsoring today's event. It's actually offered by the American Culture Center. If you don't know the American Culture Center, it's the center that hosts the race requirement for the campus. All UC Berkeley students take at least one AC course while they're here at Berkeley. It's also the host for the Staff of Students of Social Justice program. And welcome to SSSJ members. It's great to have you here. A couple of other thank yous. Thank you to the Department of Ethnic Studies, my home department, for hosting us today. And also Heyday Books. Is Kaylee in the room?
No.
No? Yeah, Heyday Books have been stars behind the scenes getting us all together today. So let's just kick us off. So we're here to discuss Tony's new book, The Scandal of Cal, Land Grabs, White Supremacy and Miseducation. The Scandal of Cal, if you haven't read it yet, is a capacious book. It demystifies and is a reckoning with the tangled threads that weave through UC Berkeley's true layers of history and the story that the university tells of itself. It's such a timely book.
I just dropped it.
As have been so many of the multitude of Tony's books. But this one is specifically timely because we're at a particularly voluminous moment, a voluminous time of storytelling for universities and higher education in general. Storytelling that declares Black Lives Matter, storytelling that declares that DIBJ initiatives are front and center, and storytelling that land acknowledgements are routine. But as many of us know too well, scrape just a little bit underneath the story, and the story fall apart. The Scandal of Cal peels back those stories so that none of it can be evaded. There is one statement, if you've got a book in your hand right now, if you turn to the back of it, there's one statement on the back cover of the book that sums up the value and the power of the book. Ruthie Gilmore, so inspirational for my own work, states simply, "This is a land acknowledgement." So wonderfully joining us today in conversation with Tony is Professor Waldo Martin, Alexander F. and Métis Morrison Professor of American History and Citizenship. From all the books, I can't list all of Waldo's books, but every time I ask Waldo to be here, to be in person, to be in conversation, Waldo jumps and says yes. So as much as he is the amazing scholar that we all know, his book Black Against Empire is central on so many of our tables at Berkeley, he's a great friend and he's a great teacher. So I'm very happy that Waldo is in conversation with Tony today. Can we give him a warm welcome?
So this is my first talk on campus for this book. I couldn't think of a better place to be doing it with you. I'm very glad to be here. I don't know about you, but there's not many places on this campus, even though I've been on and off this campus since 1963, there's not many places where I feel at home. And this is a place where I do feel at home. Any of you have that sort of ambivalent relationship with this place? Raise your hand if you do. Yes, there's quite a few ambivalent folks here. So as I walk through this campus, I usually feel a sense of ambivalence. And I feel that often in my body. I feel it physically. It's both a sense of alienation, of not being a part of this place, and it's also a sense of belonging, thus the ambivalence. It's a mixture of scorn, my critique of the university, and on the one hand, and then on the other, a mixture of longing, of wanting to be associated with this place, of being glad to be here, and so on. That mixture. I'm reminded in this feeling of the work, and his work had a big influence on mine in this book, the work of the African-American conceptual artist Fred Wilson. If you're not familiar with his work, I urge you, if you're interested in institutions and museums and the politics of cultural issues, I think his work is pioneering and so important. He said that when he was first invited to do a project on race in a museum, he felt it as a physical experience. He said there was a kind of tension in his body going into a museum and then trying to figure out how he was going to do an exhibition on issues of race and racial injustice and so on. That resonates with me when I walk through this campus. And I think one of the things I've learned from this project is knowing how when you deeply know a place, an institution, a place, a locale, a city, an organization, an institution, it can also change the way that you feel and think about it. So for me, this project, which came very late in my life and career, also provided a profound paradigm shift in the way that I think about this institution. The kind of paradigm shift that occurs when, for example, people realize that the world was round as opposed to flat. A kind of paradigm shift that I realized when I began to think of my parents as people and not just as parents. You know, that moment in your life when all of a sudden you begin to have a whole different relationship to your family and your parents and grandparents, because you begin to have an understanding of them that's different than just being your parent. It's that kind of shift, that kind of change that occurred with me. So, for example, the geography of this university itself, this building, God help us, with its manicured lawns, its glistening white buildings, all symmetrical and ordered, everything in its place, seemingly culturally neutral, but of course not. It feels at odds with my aesthetics. I don't know if it feels at odds with your aesthetics, but that's one example of being in a place which doesn't feel culturally comfortable to you. The design and architecture of this university harks back to classical Europe. It doesn't go back to its indigenous roots that was here for thousands of years, literally on this campus. Not the generic land acknowledgement that this university now does, but a real, practical, historical experience in this place, all the way from the hills of Berkeley, all the way down to the East Bay and the estuary that runs down there. And that I've always found this to be culturally and aesthetically, the campus itself, to be rather soulless. I don't know if you have that experience too. I always like to point out to students that are somewhat shocked that one of the few pieces of art I like on the campus is what I think of as the homoerotic sculpture on the entrance to the west side of the building. You know, it's two athletes, you know, and I'm sure that most people walk past it and don't think of this as being homoerotic, but there's a sort of tenderness, you know, with the one person kneeling at the feet of the other athlete and bandaging him and so on. It's a very sort of sensual appearance. And the other place that for many years, I thought was a soulful piece of art on campus was the bust of Abraham Lincoln that many of you have no doubt seen when you walk across the campus. It's on the south side of the Campanile at the bottom there. And over the years, because of the water and the rain, you know, his face looks almost, you know, there's a sadness about it that I attributed to him. And there's the rain his face looks like it's tear streaked, you know, when you look at that. And then, of course, in doing the research for this book, I found that the university did not put up that statue to honor Abraham Lincoln because of the Emancipation Proclamation. In fact, quite the contrary. It put it up in the 1900s, first of all, to honor Abraham Lincoln for authorizing the appropriation of indigenous lands in many parts of the country to be the startup for universities like Berkeley, the so-called land-grant colleges. So it's to honor somebody that authorizes the land grabs, not the Emancipation Proclamation. One of my favorite aesthetic places on campus, just to look at it physically, is the atrium or the entry hall of the engineering, or what's sometimes called the Hearst Mining Building. Some of you have gone in that building and maybe seen that. It's a rather extraordinary piece of architecture with its gorgeous design that is a copy of an important library in Paris. On the other hand, as soon as you walk in there, you realize that it profoundly honors George Hearst, which is the origins of the Hearst family wealth that played such a critical role in the origins and development of this university. And the more you know about George Hearst, the harder it is for me to go in that building and not knowing about George Hearst now to have a different relationship to the aesthetics of the place. So George Hearst, you'll see him up on one of the things here. He's one of the people when he was in the California legislature who signed against the Emancipation Proclamation. Okay? He supported the exclusion of Chinese from California and the United States. He endorsed child labor. He went in and made his fortune in the Sioux Hills and the Gold Hills in Dakota after the Sioux were run off. He exploited exploited laborers and miners in Peru, many of whom died on the job, in mining operations that made his fortune and so on. So the more I learned about George Hearst, the harder it is to go into that building and see the gorgeousness of that building and not have those two things clash. Similarly, it's hard for me to walk past the anthropology building now, knowing that it's a unconsecrated mortuary, that inside there the university claims that they know how many human remains are there. They keep using the figures, 10, 11,000, 11,500, because the remains that were brought back to campus were disassembled into body parts and put into boxes of legs, boxes of arms, and so on. And because the record keeping and the negligent care of it was so abominable, that the university really has no idea what it has. And so when I started to research that and write about it in the book, it could be 15, it could be 20,000 human remains, 90% of which have not yet been repatriated 33 years after the federal legislation. So for me, walking past that building and knowing that history, and walking past it now and seeing the Ohlone Cafe that has not been used all summer and that looks neglected and has not been kept up on the outside, with no sense of when that's going to be revitalized. That's a very sorrowful feeling for me, to have that experience, to walk past that place. Or to go past the physics building or into the physics building. It's sort of a haunted building, because for most of its history it was named after the LeConte brothers, one who became the president, the other was an important professor on campus. Both came from the Confederacy. Both were white supremacists till the day they died. And when they came looking for jobs here after Reconstruction, they asked the question, does it make any difference which side we fought on? And university officials and regents said, no, makes no difference which side you were on. We welcome you. And made one of them the president and the other one a distinguished professor. It's only in the last year or two that the name LeConte has been removed from the physics building. But you go into the physics building and go up to the 4th floor, and there's a plaque there for J. Robert Oppenheimer and his team, congratulating him on the theoretical breakthroughs he made in physics, without any mention of the, I think, about 200,000 civilians who were killed in 3 days of mass murder that's never been equaled in human history in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. There's no mention of that, only his theoretical breakthroughs. So for me, going to these places and walking through these places, this is what it evokes for me. On the other hand, and here's the ambivalence, some of my most positive intellectual and political experiences have been on this campus. Teaching for me has always been a joy. Students are never a problem, and students want to talk about these issues, want to grab these issues. The things that I talk about, students are often horrified that they didn't know this before. They have an appropriate moral, ethical response to these issues, as opposed to, well, we must study this and think about it. Researching the book in the archives of this university was a privilege. The Bancroft Library opened up for me. The librarians and the curators there made everything available, so I was able to get access to things. And I've created friendships here that have lasted a lifetime on the campus. And here, today, in this place, this feels like a homeland to me. Here we are in a room named after Barbara Christian, a brilliant intellectual on this campus, the first African-American woman to get tenure in this university. No, in 1978, very, very late, an extraordinary intellectual and leader and teacher. And it's very moving for me to be in the place named after her. And here we are in ethnic studies. And now the university likes to claim ethnic studies like it claims the free speech movement as its own. Like, we were always for this. This was always what we wanted on this campus. We always wanted ethnic studies because we're a place of diversity and inclusion, multiculturalism, etc. But what a battle it was to create this department. And it was this department and the creation of this department that began to crack open the walls of the old white boys club on this campus. So I'm glad to be in this department. Thank you to Victoria. Where's Victoria? Back there. Thank you to Victoria Robinson, who is making the American Cultural Center into a place where we can think critically and act justly. Not too many departments on campus can claim to be trying to do that. And here we are, hosted by Doug Parada, who has made this event so well organized and so welcoming. Thank you to both of you. And here I am in conversation with Professor Waldo Martin, who represents for me the best of Berkeley, a serious intellectual, politically informed, politically committed, who practices what he preaches. I appreciate being here in conversation with you. And here I am with you, faculty, students, staff, who are hungry to discuss hard issues and know that speaking truth to power is both an ethical and human thing to do. When I was denied tenure here in the 1970s in Berkeley, in the long-gone School of Criminology, you were here then. Hi, nice to see you back again. when I was denied tenure then, I got access to, because it was a legal case, I got access to all the internal documents of the tenure committee, which was a very difficult thing to do. That was the first time that anybody challenging a decision was able to get access to those documents. And in one of the faculty evaluations of my work, he said something like, and this is pretty accurate about what was said in that document. He said, you know, Platt used to be an important intellectual, and he did some serious work, and we loved the first edition of the Child Savers, the second edition less so, and he became more Marxist, you know. And then they used this phrase in the letter, and then he said that Platt seems to have lost his senses. And we don't want people on the campus here or to get tenured to be part of this university who've lost their senses. So for me, though, as a left intellectual, as a radical intellectual, in theory and in practice, for most of my life, I've always felt that activism sharpens our senses. It doesn't blunt them. It doesn't destroy them. It sharpens them, and it sharpens them because I think the work that we do, like this book, I'm hoping this book will be used by activists who take on this battle of getting a university to deal with this history and this past. It has to be good. You know, the research has to be thorough. It has to be persuasive. It has to be backed up by argument and so on, because and people's lives and people's futures and people's experiences are going to rely on it. So in a way, you know, when you're a politically committed intellectual, your work has to be even better than before you were a politically committed intellectual. Your senses are sharpened is a good thing. So I'm glad to be here with like-minded folks like you, with your sharpened senses of justice. Thank you for introducing me thank you for inviting me into your home here. This is the best place for me to introduce the book on campus. Thank you.
Before we get started, I want to say what a pleasure it is to see all of these faces. I'm always gratified when someone actually shows up. And I see a lot of friends and colleagues. That's another reason for gratitude and happiness. I can't remember when I first met Tony, but I've always admired not only his scholarship, but his principled activism. And I've been a guest in his home. We've shared many a cocktail. The last place we went to went out of business, so we'll have to find a new place. But when I read the book, for me, it was a very difficult experience because I don't know how many of you all have actually read it. But the way I like to think about it is the sins, the S-I-N-S, the wrongs, the injustices, the evil is great. I mean, there's a lot of horror here. There's a lot of tragedy here, especially in terms of how the indigenous people were dispossessed of their land, how this place comes to be created, sort of the whole way in which the early history that I learned about many years ago was, as he says, part of something he calls the California history, which is, you know, very much romantic and very much nostalgic. And so I knew a lot of these individual pieces, but I think the brilliance of this book is the way in which he puts it all together and forces us to rethink, well, what is this place we call Cal? And I also want to shout out to those who made this possible. Barbara Christian was one of my close personal friends. I first met her in the mid-'70s. She's one of the people who helped me negotiate this space called Cal. And many a moment in her home and at her, you know, various intellectual and scholarly salons, you know, I look back on as immeasurable in terms of its impact on me. Plus, she was really cool, and I love cool. What I wanted to start with is part of what Tony was talking about is sort of what scholars and what historians do. And what I really wanted you just to reflect on initially was why you wrote this book. I think part of it you talked about, but I think you've been engaged in a series of projects that this book obviously relates to. But why this book? Why? Because I think the pandemic had something to do with it. So how did you just come to write this book? You had the pandemic, you had to do something with your life. And so it's like, let me read. Because I know you have other writing projects, and why all of a sudden did this project loom so important for you?
Yeah, I know for academics here that you pick a topic and you write a proposal and you try to get time off, or you try to get things funded and approach it in a very purposeful way, writing a book. And that used to be me for a long time, but now this is the third book where the book chose me rather than me choosing the book. And so this started as a political project. About 4 years ago, a group of us got together on the Berkeley campus, calling ourselves, still exist, the Truth and Justice Project. And the project included a small number of Native American faculty on campus, small number of Native American staff, and then students primarily in the law school, because I taught a class with Seth Davis, Professor Seth Davis in the law school, and generated aspects of this project in that class. And then I taught a class with Sue Schweik in humanities. Unfortunately, she's now retired, but that was an extraordinary class called Legacies of Eugenics at Berkeley. There'd never been such a class. And then I worked closely with Najun Menka, who taught a class last semester on this campus with the amazing title of Decolonizing Berkeley. When she and I were talking about this class and thinking about the idea for it and so on, that was our working title. Never did we imagine that it would get into the curriculum as Decolonizing Berkeley, as the title of the class. But the project was, the Truth and Justice Project was originally set up for one purpose only, and that was to try to understand why there had been so much profound ongoing resistance by the university to complying with federal legislation of 1990, now 33 years ago, to repatriate Native American human remains and also cultural and ceremonial artifacts to tribes and to Native organizations, federally recognized and not federally recognized tribes, to return those under the NAGPRA was the acronym for the legislation in 1990, which in many ways is considered to be like a major piece of civil rights legislation for Native Americans in the country, because the pilfering of graves and the stealing of human remains and artifacts was such a fundamental part of colonialism and conquest in this country. Genocide followed by that profound indignity. And that this legislation was a huge battle from Native organizations and tribes to get it passed. And then when it was passed, the estimate was it would take about 5 years that universities would be required, universities, museums, any institution that got their funds from the federal government would be required to do an inventory, and then to post that inventory on the federal websites, and then the tribes could then make claims to get things back. And so Berkeley was the most recalcitrant in doing an inventory, and made an inventory that I think was incredibly negligent, because they really didn't know what they had. Things had just been scattered all over the campus and kept in the most disgusting ways. And so they did an inventory where they were sort of copying the records they already had without questioning whether those records, what they represented, or whether they were accurate and so on. And then as ProPublica and NBC in a recent report that drew in part on the research that the Truth and Justice Project did, pointed out that University of California, primarily Berkeley, because it was Berkeley for the first 50 years of the University of California, failed to comply with NAGPRA and is the most recalcitrant in compliance in the United States. Also said that Berkeley has the largest, I use the word collection, it's a horrible way to objectify human beings. That's what the university calls this this assembly of corpses and ancestors. They call it that. ProPublica agreed with our assessment that the University of California has the largest number of human remains in the United States. I think it's very likely the largest in the world. And I don't try to be hyperbolic. I don't think, we don't have to make things worse than they are, they're bad enough. So, but I think from what I've known, having done some research in Europe and so on, which is the model for what California did, I think this is certainly up there with the top 3 or 4, if not the largest collection. So the project began, like, why has the university failed to repatriate, and what's the reasons for that? How do we explain that? How do we understand that? And my job was to be in charge of the research, and to do the research for that, and to work with students, and to be involved in classes, and to bring people into doing different parts of this. So in the course of that, it became a little bit like pulling on the thread. You've got a piece of clothing, and the thread it's beginning to come apart, and you pull on that thread. So once I began to pull on that thread, really the big question that I asked before it became a book even was the treatment of indigenous people alive and dead in this country by this university, was that exceptional, or was it systemic? That's the big question. Is this like part of a larger way of thinking about the world, thinking about the purpose of the university, organizing its curriculum, bringing in its faculty, bringing in its regents, promoting a certain worldview and so on? Is that part of that systematic worldview, or was this exceptional? So to answer that question, I had to then follow the trails.
Okay. And one of I'm a spirit person. So if anybody feels moved by the spirit and a question must be asked, let it bubble to the top and say, hey, shout out, There's several threads that I found particularly compelling. One was the way in which you connect sort of the institutional development of Cal, especially archaeology and anthropology, and its role in sort of the perpetuation and the institutionalization of white supremacy, or whatever you want to call it. But so there's that whole piece, and then the role of related departments at Cal, and then sort of thinking about the Los Alamos sort of lab, the creation of the bomb, and sort of how all of this fits into this vision of this place as sort of a cutting edge frontier for let there be light and all these other kinds of ways. And what you do is you show that, and you have these great turns of phrases. For example, in that very first section, you talk about that archive of death, how the university fundamentally has created an archive of death. And so how do you look at that, and how do you use that then to think about the relationship of this place to indigenous people? And so one of the things that I'd also like you to do is to think about and discuss, or tell us a little bit about the various departmental institutional histories that you're able to pull together to make the argument and to weave your story.
That's a big set of questions.
Well, we got a lot of time. Well, you can, just.
Okay, let me try to at least start it off. Okay.
Yeah.
So there's a lot in the book about anthropology and archaeology. The Department of Anthropology didn't start in this university until 1900, 1901. University is established in the 1860s. People start arriving on this campus, and some classes were taught in Oakland in the 1860s. It's in the 1870s that actually this land is cleared, and human remains are dug up, and artifacts are found all over the place. And then on top of that, they start to build this campus, bringing in architects and designers who modeled all the buildings. You can just look out of the window here and begin to see them. modeled them on classical and neoclassical European design, so that it would appear like this is European civilization coming to the wilderness, right? In fact, the very slogan, I mean, I got a fundraising letter today. Some of you probably got this as well in the mail, like a little fundraising reminder, and they always put Fiat Lux on it. And if you get a letter from the chancellor every week, a statement about what's going on in the university or what she wants us to know is going on in the university, it always ends up with Fiat Lux, you know, let there be light. And every time you walk under the gate on campus, it says Fiat Lux there. This is the slogan of the university. So, you know, early on, I started doing, it doesn't take much to do a little research on that. And those of you that went through your Bible studies here know that Fiat Lux means let there be light, and it comes from the first book of Genesis. There was darkness. There was darkness, and then God said, let there be light. There was darkness, and then the University of California arrived and said, let there be light. So that, you know, that metaphor for me is a very powerful one, and the fact that it continues to be used as a branding and as a slogan today just shows how unexamined this slogan is for the university. This sense of coming to a place that has nothing, that has darkness, that has a wilderness. Even as they're digging up human remains on this very land. I'm not talking about this generically. We know exactly where this happened from the internal records of the university. And we know about all the people that either collected artifacts that were found on this campus, or gave them to the anthropology department, or made gifts of them to the university, and so on. And the university today, when it talks about this, I've noticed that they sort of slip into, well, anthropology in those days, you know, believed in sort of a racist science, and we don't believe in that anymore, and, you know, we're sort of over that. And there's two parts to that I found really interesting. One is that they sort of want to put the burden back on anthropology and archaeology for what happened. But this was I found a central university project. The collecting of human remains, the collecting of artifacts, the amassing of all this stuff. And the chapter that I have on this, I used to think of it as scientific racism and so on, but the chapter I call it hoarding. That after a while, it's because they're doing yes, the science that they did was a racist science, eugenics, but they hardly did any science. Maybe on, I don't know, 1% of the human remains, they did some science on them. Everything else, they're just collecting stuff and amassing it and showing how much they have, you know, like collectors and hoarders do. You want to just keep getting more and more and more. And it's appearing in the regents' records, it's appearing in the university officials' records, they're showing this off. Today, they like to think about this as something being contained in anthropology, but this was a central project of the university. And I think it was a central project in large part because the Hearst family, particularly Phoebe Hearst, after George died, inherited his incredible wealth, is that she was really into archaeology and anthropology. And what surprised me, there's a lot of things that surprised me doing research for this book, and I think when you do research, you should always be open to the surprises. I think that's one of the fantastic creative parts of trying to do intellectual work. You're not just going in to prove something you already know. So one of the things that totally surprised me is that I thought Phoebe Hearst gave money to the university and said, okay, please put this money into the anthropology department. But no, she ran the anthropology department for the first 8 or 9 years. I mean, people would send her their budget proposals for the year, in the same way that people today, you send them up to the chancellor's office, you know, your proposals. And then she would authorize it, and she'd write the check, and it would go directly for the plumbing and the fixtures and the salaries and the research and so on. So she was not only directly involved, but long before Berkeley began to really dig up Native American grave sites in California, it was doing this globally. So the first serious operations took place in Egypt, Mexico, and Peru. So that raises the question of why that? You know, why go to another part of the world with expeditions, very expensive expeditions, dig up graves and bring back human remains and artifacts from Egypt, Peru, Mexico, before this really takes off in California? And that to me is another clue. It's like another clue like Fiat Lux, because it's a clue that the university wants to compete with the big boys in the world. It wants to be competitive with the imperialist powers in the world. It imagines itself a Harvard. It imagines itself a British Museum. And if you go into the big European universities of this period of time, they are sending off their expeditions, Germany, England, France, and so on. They're going into Africa. They're also bringing back human remains and artifacts and so on. It's part of a colonial operation. So to me, that's very significant that Berkeley imagined itself playing on that stage, on that global stage, that global colonial stage, and operating in that way. And this was a university project. Now and much later on, they say, well, these were, a few bad anthropologists. Bad actors is the term they like to use. I hate that term. If anything, it's a bad institution, yes.
Can I ask something? I'm very pleased that you are putting this in as a plan of kind of bigger archaeology around the world. But this has another aspect, which is also researching the indigenous in Europe. So, for example, this is around the time that old Scandinavians are being dug up in bogs, and all of these ships of, Viking funerals are also dug up.
Absolutely.
And in Ireland too, not only in Scandinavian countries. And this is not just there is a colonial aspect to it, absolutely, but there's also a search for the indigenous there.
Right.
So how do you insert this in your story?
I ask for your information and your knowledge, and then I incorporate it. So is this something you're working on?
I am a medievalist. I don't work on medieval Scandinavia.
Yeah.
I don't want to kind of steal your thunder and give a lecture here, but we can get together for coffee and discuss.
We can. So yes, I mean, I see the work that I've done is like opening up all these doors to different kinds of possibilities. Up here on the back here, you're going to see, for example, an image of the cow band in blackface. That was a total shock to find that. I didn't expect to find that.
Yeah.
And that history's not been written. I mean, there's many things that I bring into the story that need to be really investigated by people. This is an incredible opportunity for research projects and writing and so on. I was really struck, I'll come back to your point, but I was really struck when I started this project. I said, okay, the first thing I'll do is I'll read critical histories of the University of California. There are none. There are none. There are histories of California, but they're very much in-house histories. They're administrative histories. They're sponsored by administration and so on. And this happened and then that happened, and then we brought in this famous person, and then it got bigger and better, and then we did research on this and so on. Those kinds of administrative histories. And there's memoirs and different kinds of critical pieces by people that were involved in political issues on campus, but there was no critical history of the past. And that struck me. That's an interesting question, why those of us that have been involved with this university are reluctant to investigate our own place. We can come back to that, but I think I see a sort of a contract here. You want to be at Berkeley, you want to move up the ladder, we'll pull you up the ladder, but you don't want to bite the hand that's pulling you up the ladder. I mean, that's what I think sort of goes on here. And if you do bite the hand, like I and my colleagues at the School of Criminology did in the early 1970s, they closed down the oldest, longest lasting criminology program in the world. That wasn't just about closing down our program, it was also sending a message to everybody else on campus. This is what happens if you cross the line here. So just to go back to that point very quickly. So the way I started to think about this in terms of the United States is that there are two aspects of this that become very important in the scientific community about human remains. One is there's a lot of work going on the origins of the species, and this is going on in Europe and it's going on in the Americas and so on. And so people are looking for the origins of the species. And I think with what I found when I went through the writings of anthropologists in particular, is that when they looked at indigenous history, and they did do indigenous histories and collected languages and did all kinds of things besides digging up human remains and so on, they tended to characterize indigenous people as being like stuck in amber. So if you dug up human remains from 1,000 years ago, it's the same as 5,000 years ago or 10,000 years ago, because they never really progressed, they never really shifted, they never really changed. They were stuck in darkness. And so if you get access to human remains and ancestors in that way, if it's 1,000 or 5,000 years ago and you can do scientific research on them, maybe that'll give us some information about the origins of the human species. And of course, that in the 19th century, that's a big scientific topic. The other big topic is racial differences. And so there's a huge research, what today we would call eugenics, which is still very much alive and very strong. And part of the book, we can maybe talk about it later on, is again finding out how many Berkeley intellectuals were deeply involved in the ideas of eugenics. There were some people that were, loved the Nazis, but there weren't many of them. But there was a widespread group of people involved in thinking about the world using eugenics framework. And so the other thing that the scientists were then doing were looking for racial differences. And around indigenous people in California, I mean, it's so absurd, it's sort of laughable, is that they were trying to explain why Native people had disappeared, right? What was it in their bones or their brains or their crania or their genetic structures that made them susceptible to disappear, I know, you have to laugh at the absurdity of that, particularly when this is taking place in the wake of a genocide, number one, and number two, when the same proportion of Native people survived genocide as the proportion of Jews in Europe survived the Holocaust. So people are alive, they're organizing, they're carrying on ceremonies, they're trying to recreate communities, they're fighting back, they're politically organizing and so on. So certainly they haven't disappeared, But I think the science had a lot to, when you look at the scientific people writing about that, that's what they're trying to look for, the racial difference. How come the white folks are so superior and brilliant and civilized compared to other people? And there was a lot of that going on in the United States and at Berkeley. But I think your point raises a big critique of a lot of the work that goes on in the United States, including my own, is it tends to be very nation-centric and not sufficiently comparative to look at this. So this opens up a whole comparative field. We always tend to think about the United States as in exceptional ways. It's what it means to live in an imperial society, But so I think that we need to come back to that issue that you raised, and that's something that needs to be looked at very seriously. Thank you.
Yeah, and my reading of your text suggests that there wasn't a lot of empathy or sympathy among intellectuals and scholars for really understanding indigenous people, that there were few and far between. There were a few people here and there who sort of thought that there may be something called human equality, or, but they were so few, and they certainly didn't have any power or influence.
Yeah.
And what I also found very fascinating was the relationship between Kroeber and Boas, because Boas has this cultural relativism, and I really like the way you describe Kroeber as a shapeshifter. Whatever it takes, you do what you have to do to get what you want. I mean, he's just deeply political. He's over here on this, he's over there. He seems on some level deeply unprincipled. And so toward the end, he begins to give a few speeches where, he acknowledges sort of this relativism and sort of, gestures in certain directions, but the power that he's wielding and all of that is pushing in other directions. So he's doing all. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I constantly looked for people within the university that resisted and stood up. I mean, it was so exciting to find people. There weren't many, I'll tell you that. There weren't many. So there was a very important biologist, man named Loeb, who was he was immigrant, he was Jewish, he was socialist, he was pacifist. I mean, he didn't last long at Berkeley, but he went to New York and did very well and became a very important biologist. People like him were run out or were fired, or there were people of German background during World War I who were literally fired or forced to sign loyalty oaths long before the 50s, loyalty oaths on this campus. So I was always looking for people like this guy Loeb and other people, and so the book starts off, it was sort of a relief because, you just read the archive of death, these archaeologists and anthropologists and go into their field records and so on. It's just hard, it's like that project that was done a few years ago, the guy that did the book on the postcards of lynching, did a book on that, did an exhibition on and so on. And you can't just go into that and like walk through the exhibition, look at lynching postcards. You got to stop and take your breath and, figure out how you need to look at it, I think. I think you need to look at that. And I have that book, and I looked at that book quite a few times and stop and then start again. So going through the archaeological records, the archive of death, as I called it, you know, reading somebody's field notes where they said, oh, you know, we dug up 25 remains today, and then we went off to town and had dinner and saw a movie. You know, that kind of field record, like where you can make a total distinction between the humanity of what you're doing and the people that are being dug up and so on. And that's not to mention the thousands of people who were not brought back to the Berkeley campus, but were just dumped into pits. That's not covered under the federal legislation. But there's an ethical, moral issue there. What does it mean to encourage people around the state, as Berkeley did, to go out and dig up places, and here you can go here, and here's a village site, and tell us what you found. And then for the archaeologists themselves to go there and dig things up and to bring back maybe bring back 1 out of 3 or 1 out of 4 out of 1 out of 5 of human remains, and then just to dump the rest back into a pit without any ceremony, without any ritual, without any solemnity. I mean, just think about the horror of that, objectifying people in that, so that a grave becomes a place for specimens, not for ancestors. So whenever I found somebody, so I did find Robert Heiser, who was a very important anthropologist at Berkeley and who was involved in this all his career, leading expeditions, digging up human remains, bringing them back to Berkeley and so on. And he was here at the end of his career in the 1960s when the free speech movement and political activism happened on campus. Many faculty members turned against that movement, particularly senior faculty, you know, were horrified that students were so uppity all of a sudden. But Heiser, to his benefit, just stopped and said, what have I been doing with my life? You know, how could I have done this? And how do I make amends? So he started writing about genocide. He started writing some incredible things in the last few years of his life, and worked with Theodora Kroeber, who was the widow of Alfred Kroeber, the head of the anthropology department for many years, really from the 1910s until he retired in 1947 or something like that, his whole career. So Kroeber is probably the person I get the most pushback from people in anthropology, because Kroeber did some extraordinary things. He made friendships with people. He had informants in native communities that became his friends. He wrote a book with Robert Spott, the Robert Spott, where Spott is the first name and the book. Kroeber's name is second. That's always a sign, you know, where you get your name on a book when you're an author. As a co-author, he put the Yurok name first before his own. He managed to get people to record and talk about languages when they were hard to maintain and so on. And today people use the field notes that Kroeber created around ceremonies and cultural life and languages. That's still very much a part of revitalization of Native American culture in California and elsewhere. On the other hand, this is why I ended up calling him a shapeshifter. He's the department of the anthropology department from about 1909 until he retires in about 1947. And for those of you who know university politics, you know what it means to be a chair of a department. You have to be a shapeshifter. So he oversighted eugenics research. He oversighted the collection of human remains. The human remains under his watch increased massively. He ran a department like a politician, a powerful, for many years, a very powerful department with strong ties to the administration, and he's reporting back to the administration. So yes, he's collecting cultural ceremonies, he's developing ties with native informants and so on that sometimes are mutually respectful. And then on the other hand, he's just bringing in the ancestors, the bodies, the human remains, and about 1 million artifacts. So he does both. So human beings are contradictory, right? I mean, you've got to look at that contradiction. But I sometimes, unlike Robert Heiser, he never stopped and said, "Oh my God, what have I done with my life? You know, how could I do this? How could I be a part of this?" I mean, I know he saw a psychiatrist and he was very interested in psychology and he was depressed for a part of his life and so on. But still he never wrote about that. You know, he never publicly wrote about or spoke out against the genocide. He knew it intimately. He probably knew more about genocide than anybody else. He never wrote about the fact that the Ohlone in the Bay Area had survived and carried on and resisted. He talked about them sort of like a disappearing tribe. So these are the contradictions, and you have to then come to terms with that person.
Yeah.
Somebody had to say that.
Okay, See a hand back here and then a hand over here. Oh, I see. Wait, let me stand up. I see two. Why don't we go here, here, and then over here?
Hi. So you've been talking about a lot about the pushback from, like, you know, Berkeley, and just now you're saying there was like a reluctance to investigate your own place. So, you know, university angle, but that made me think of, like, I think it's very interesting that your book was published now, especially with a lot of the book bannings that have been going along in the country recently, and the pushback against certain areas of study, like the African American study, like AP course in Florida and in Texas and in Arkansas and the South in general. So I don't know if you can speak about like the larger subset of America where there's this reluctance to investigate and even acknowledge certain things that happened in our past, and how a lot on the right and even some people on the left want to whitewash like swaths of our history, like even acknowledging that founding fathers owned slaves is like controversial now. Like you can't say certain things because it gets people feeling guilty, it gets hurt feelings, and a lot on the right don't want to even acknowledge this stuff. They just want it to go away and move on. So I think your book is very important in that aspect, that acknowledging certain atrocities that happen helps us move forward. But what do you do when there's like such violent pushback and it's getting like federally or state-wise like laws that are being made that you can't say certain things anymore, like censorship in that way?
Yeah, there's a long history of pushback. I think it takes different forms at different times. I know, part of one time in my political history, my left political history, I used to think that there was sort of that the left would progress in the world, that capitalism would begin to go into demise, that different kinds of socialist and communist countries would unite or form some kind of coalition, that the world system would tip in the favor of regions of the world fighting for equality and independence and dignity and so on. I think the language I use in this book, and which I now think politically, I use the metaphor of a zigzag. You make progress, you lose ground. You make progress, you lose ground. So, what you were saying, I agree with it. That's definitely going on now, but there's a long history of that. I don't think there's ever been there hasn't been a time in this country when you've fought for extraordinary changes and then you've met incredible pushback. Probably, the most powerful example of that is Reconstruction in the United States. I mean, Reconstruction was an extraordinary moment of trying to bring democracy and civil rights to the United States. And it's the beginning of the civil rights movement that then has success 100 years later. It takes 100 years for the civil rights movement to at least to have the success on some legal and political framework, and is now fighting to keep that success that was also somewhat limited, the success of the 1960s. But if you think of it as a battle that took place for 100 years, beginning in the 1860s, beginning with Reconstruction, then that's just the way that I begin to think about this. So what you described is true, but I see this as sort of a continuous battle on different fronts. And to me, what's really interesting about this project is that, one, that I hadn't really, given all the time I've spent on this campus, that I didn't really know my own history. So I felt like with this, very likely the last serious piece of work that I do here like this, that I have an obligation to try to come to terms with a place that I thought that I knew. And secondly, what really interests me is, what does it mean to look at the history, not of the ultra right wing and the nationalist right wing, the white supremacist right wing, but to look at a place that considers itself to be a bastion of liberalism. The university as a bastion of liberalism. I mean, that's the language it uses about itself. So what does it mean? We know about the right because they're very explicit about their white supremacy, about their eugenics. They're about to have a big conference in Florida on eugenics coming up very soon. They talk about it very openly, and one of the things that their power increased because the Trump administration then made it okay to talk about this in a much more open public way. Thank you. A Harvard that got its start by economically benefiting from the trade in African human beings, the slave trade. How did a place like Harvard, and I think California, there's a number of places on the East Coast, universities, that particularly of the struggle to get these universities to come to terms with its involvement in the trade in human beings, that those universities over the last 10 years, 15 years, have begun to try to address that in different ways. And those struggles are at different points, but nothing like that has taken place on the West Coast in a way that California, we were against slavery, that wasn't our problem. And yes, it's terrible what happened on the East Coast and with the Harvards and those universities and somehow we're exempt for that because we bring light, we bring knowledge. And you can go into the library today. A few weeks ago when the university in Dublin, Ireland, decided to rename its important library after Bishop Berkeley, after who the university is named here, went through a whole process of unnaming their library after the Irish Bishop Berkeley, who was an important philosopher, but he also supported the slave trade. He actually owned human beings on a plantation when he came to the United States. And he also advocated the kidnapping of Native American children up to the age of 10, then Christianizing them and then sending them back to the tribes. That's the man that this town and this university is named after. And so when the university in Ireland decided to unname him, then the New York Times had a front page story asking what is Berkeley going to do about this? What's the university going to do about it here? And the Berkeley spokesperson, never the chancellor, it's usually the spokesperson, the public relations flack that handles this, said, well, we're not changing the name because nobody wants us to. Nobody's asking us to change it. But also, we've imbued the name Berkeley with a whole set of different meanings. It now stands for equality and diversity and multiculturalism, et cetera, et cetera. So we've taken a name associated with, racism and white supremacy, and we've reinfused that name and that identity with something standing for equality. So the day after that story, I went into the Doe Library, because I got to know the campus really well during COVID, and went up to the Morrison room in the Doe Library, and that beautiful library room with the sculptured ceiling and so on, because I remembered what I'd seen there. And there, the day after this announcement, is this important original painting of Bishop Berkeley on the wall, honoring him. And just around the corner from the painting, I think it's still there, just around the corner from him in that room is a plaque describing who he is, so that, because people don't know, and it leaves out those two important aspects of who he is. Leaves out the slavery part and the kidnapping Native kids part, It has to be done knowingly because everybody knows that about him. So it's those kinds of examples, and the university is full of those kinds of examples. It's how an institution that calls itself a liberal place, how it creates that ethos about itself, that mythology about itself, how it does that. And so, yes, we've got to take on the right. I absolutely agree with you and speak out about it. But for me, I think we have to also speak out against the place that we know best, which is this place.
I think we want to go right here and then over here.
Hi, thank you so much for your work. I'm Miseducation.
Oh, we haven't met, have we? We haven't. We met him, yeah.
So, as you know,
Why don't you say a little bit about your work? Because I thought that that project that you just did, and the way you reimagined the campus, that was a fantastic project.
Thank you.
Could you just tell people about what it is? Otherwise, so that they're not totally depressed by what I'm saying?
Well, and I wanted to name a hopeful person that. So I write about the cultural natural resources and the agricultural aspect of the very particular land grant mission because the cultural natural resources, notice I'm calling it that and not its new name, it still gets federal funding and state funding to fulfill the land grant mission that came with the original Morale Act. So my dissertation, after being a staff person in the college for a decade before I became a PhD student in the college, is really looking at what agriculture schools are doing to kind of think of through some of these pieces that really got explicitly exposed by Robert Lee and Tristan Letton's work around land grant universities. So that's one element of it. But a lot of the eugenics work also took place in the nutrition department that was part of the cultural natural resources back through the 1920s. But, and the piece that Tony's mentioning is I recently read about Hillguard Hall and reimagining what Hillguard Hall might be. Hillguard is a lot of those southern folks who was at the University of Mississippi during the Civil War and close friends with the LeConte brothers. But Hillguard Hall is a very interesting, beautiful, ugly building on campus that has a lot of history. So, but what I wanted to mention when you were talking about looking for the hopeful people, there's a really hopeful person in the College of Natural Resources and that's Paul S. Taylor, that from the 20s through the 60s was agricultural economist who
Dorothea Lange.
also partnered with Dorothea Lange.
Yeah.
Sometimes put his name second, so she would get credit on books. When they did projects together, she was a non-academic. We define an academic by being someone with a PhD who works at the union. But Paul S. Taylor was doing a lot of work for decades around fighting the white supremacy that was in the agricultural education at UC Berkeley around labor. Well, the Department of Agricultural Resource Economics was supporting the Bracero program. He was working against it. He did some of the first studies about the actual lived experiences of immigrant Mexican laborers. He did work to reveal how the agricultural schools involved in the Chinese Exclusion Act, and then he did work on water rights all the way up through when he retired. So I just wanted to shout him out as another one of these people in another corner of campus that we can look to.
No, thank you for raising that. Paul Taylor, very important progressive economist involved in some of the kind of work that you were describing there. I mean, I think one of the things that struck me in trying to look for the history of resistance on this campus and political organizing and so on, is that there's been a tendency, myself included in the past, to sort of get stuck in the 60s. And, that Berkeley in the 60s, I really dislike the term 60s because in fact, you're going to maybe elaborate on this. If you think about the political cultural movements that we associate with the 60s, they really come out of the aftermath of World War II. They're really starting in the mid-40s and the aftermath of that whole sweep of history. But the way that the new left and predominantly white left then tends to make the 60s sort of be the starting point. And so we tend to think of like political activism. Maybe there was the opposition to the loyalty oath in the 50s, but beyond that, nothing. So, but for example, the obligatory military training on campus took place from the 1860s until through the 1950s. Male students in particular, were required to go through military training. They had to get an exemption, a medical or other kind of exemption from it and so on. And there was constant opposition to that, constant political opposition to that. There was also political opposition to being limited about what you could say politically on the campus. So the free speech movement has a much longer, deeper history than the so-called 60s and so on. So I just think that the histories, because we're not talking about one history. I know that there were African American women who were undergraduates on the Berkeley campus early in the 20th century. That story is not being told. I mean, I'm hoping that, I don't see what I've done as being, this is a definitive history. This is sort of like opening up some possibilities, and then the Paul Taylors and other people would need to be part of a new way of understanding and imagining this university.
Okay, well, I think we need to come over here, and then over here and over here. Okay, right here, brother.
Yeah, the discussion this afternoon has been mainly about.
Could you just introduce yourself too?
Oh, my name is Harvey Smith, and what I'm going to actually mention and I'd like a comment is that the misinformation continues today. It's actually in the front page of the Daily Cal. We have disinformation from the campus spokesperson on the front page. So I'm wondering, what would you consider, you mentioned Bishop Berkeley and what's happening right now with that, but what are the current scandals that we're facing on this campus?
We don't have enough time.
Football.
Harvey Smith is one of the leading activists trying to protect and preserve People's Park. Done very, very important work on that. And the whole People's Park project, I mean, for those of us that are on the campus and get the daily and weekly bulletins, those warning bulletins, I have an idea for a project. for those of you not on the campus, we get these things that say warning at the top.
Don't show
And then
up.
underneath it, it says something to protect our feelings like, don't be upset. You might be upset by some of the information in this warning, and it's going to tell you that somebody was like robbed of their phone on the street or something, Very careful about protecting our feelings and so on. But we get these warnings all the time. And for those, when I speak to students who come from Chicago, Detroit, New York, Baltimore, Los Angeles, and we talk about like the crime problem, people that from those cities know what a crime is like. And so in many ways, I think, I've lived in Berkeley just most of my adult life, that Berkeley is one of the most law-abiding places in the world that I've ever lived in, So there's a lot of petty crime, and the warnings are always about things that happen off the campus. It's like we have the most law-abiding people on this campus. There's no sexual violence, there's no sexual assault, there's nobody stealing money, there's nobody plagiarizing articles. I mean, my God, what a law-abiding community we have. And I found a statement from the chief of police from the 1970s when he was being interviewed, and he said, the main crime problem we have in Berkeley comes from outside the university, this area around the university, that is now the battle over People's Park. So this moral hysteria that's being created around People's Park. And I went out on one of the official tours that the campus does. That's really interesting to do that if you haven't done that. Take an official campus tour to see, you want to see the public relations narrative of what the university is. But the parents had a lot of questions about the crime problem in Berkeley and how safe Berkeley is and what's going on at People's Park. And the one tour I was at, we ended up at People's Park with all of a sudden free speech movement is something that the university endorsed, in the way they tell this history. And they're doing the sum up in the near Save the Gate, and over on at the entrance to the university in Bancroft there's a demonstration going on there, and because you could see some flags and posters and banners and so on. Small demonstration. This was a few months ago, and the tour guide, who was graduating after the tour and going on to work, I asked him afterwards, "What are you doing?" He said, "I'm going to go and do public relations for the Air Force." He had a job doing public relations for the Air Force, which I thought that you're perfectly suited for that job, And so people were looking like, what's going on there? And then his little rap to the parents worried about crime on the streets and so on. He said, don't worry, that there's a little demonstration over there, but that never happens at Berkeley these days. You don't have to worry about any demonstrations taking place here. That's not, your children are going to be safe here. That's that sense of that kind of, anxiety. When we talk about moral panics in criminology, that's like, moral panics don't come they're not populist from the ground up, they're created. Mm-hmm. And the university, I think, has created this moral panic around crime in Berkeley. Correct, Professor Simon? Really? Anyway.
Okay. Before I want to continue, one of the things I wanted to hear you weigh in on was where do we go from here? At the end of the book, you ask a series of questions, and you call them big questions. And one of the big questions that I was really interested in is thinking about the history of Cal. Is there a history of Cal that includes indigenous people before the emergence of, say, for example, Native American studies? How can you write a history of Cal from those moments of resistance, those moments of pushback, or is it mostly one of domination from the top? Is there sort of some movement from below that you can talk about in terms of a history of Cal? Yeah. Because I don't see it, but there may be something there that I don't know anything about.
Well, I think COVID shut down a lot of movement activity on this campus for 2 or 3 years, and I think we're still the aftermath of that. Things have not geared up again. I mean, there have been some extraordinary shifts. in the last 10 or 20 years around indigenous issues in California. You know, tribes now have a voice in the legislature they didn't have before. The tribes have a political organization that was set up in the governor's office. Newsom has issued public statements talking about genocide and setting up the need for truth and healing projects and so on. This university finally and reluctantly has issued some, not an official apology, but whenever the chancellor or the chancellor's spokesperson is interviewed and said, you know, what do you think about this? There's always some kind of apology. Yes, we did that, and it was in the past, and it was wrong. You know, there was a scientific racism. There's a language of apologies now, and people always say to me, like, well, isn't this language it's just a way of like saying something but not doing anything? That's partly true, but when you've had, you know, 100 years of no apologies, opening the door to an apology is important. And there was a lower level administrator who 3 years ago worked with me on her own initiative to develop a very serious apology statement. And she'd give me a draft and I'd give her feedback and so on. She's no longer an administrator, quite high up. It was a very powerful statement that she said that she submitted to the chancellor, and then it died. But it was a serious apology. It wasn't just like a generic apology. It was like, we did this, this, and this, and all the different things that had happened and so on. And because when you do a serious apology, it should be the beginning of a whole process, not the end of it. And I think the university sees it as public relations, you know. So that's happened. We now have a Center for Native American Students on campus that we didn't have before. We have the university now saying that they're going to speed up repatriation 33 years later, and they're going to put more resources and money into it and so on. There's skepticism about that. I'm on the skeptical side about that. When you read the chancellor's statements about raising money for the new computer building and different projects, bioengineering and so on, you never read a statement coming out of the chancellor's office saying we're going on a big fundraising drive to do something about the legacies of accumulating human remains. This is now going to be a campaign where Harvard raised $100 million for dealing with the legacies of the slave trade on that campus. There's no such comparable drive for that. There's no discussion about giving land back. University of California is one of the largest landowners in the state of California. Incredible amounts of land. It doesn't need People's Park to build housing, you know. Why doesn't it tell us what land it has and why it's choosing People's Park over all the other possible sites that they have? Massive land holdings, which you can get access to because they have to publish these land holdings. For tribes in the Bay Area, except for one, which the university now controls and says that it owns their human remains and their ceremonial artifacts, they have no land. So how can you have ceremonies of reburials? How can you have land for reburials if you don't have land? But this is not yet on the agenda. Throughout California, Native struggles are now making land back, I would say, the major demand for dealing with the legacies of racism and white supremacy as far as indigenous people are concerned in California. Without land back, you can't talk about repatriation in the Bay Area. Where are people going to bury people? Plus you need resources, you need money, you need places to maintain the human remains, you need experts. It's a very expensive operation to do that seriously, and also you need land, where you can give people a dignified reburial if that's what you want to do. So all of those things are not yet on the table. And you know, when I ended up the book, I didn't want to just come up with a whole set of policy, right? University always comes up with, we'll set up a task force on repatriation. You know, we'll pass a new policy to speed up repatriation. We'll ask the regents for a bit more money to do this and so on. Everything gets siloed into these different little committees and things. But the 2 points I make at the end, which are the language I wanted to use at the end, is one is that I think the university as an institution needs to reckon with this history. This has to be a deep pondering. Everything sort of has to stop, and we have to talk about these issues. You know, I used to call for socialism and radical transformations of society. Now I'm calling for a public conversation. You know, I've lowered my sights in terms of like what we should try to get, you know, a public conversation about these issues. People's Park is a perfect example of something where there's been no public conversation on this campus. So the university's propaganda about People's Park is the one that prevails. Most people think that, you know, People's Park is like a hotbed of crime, that the people who use the park, you know, made it into a dumping ground, that it's unsafe, that we don't have much land to build student housing, that they're going to set up this wonderful memorial to what happened there. Remember that People's Park was created after one person was killed by the sheriff's deputies, another person was blinded, many people were arrested, myself included, at one of the anniversaries. Students were disciplined, lost their positions at the university. The university says they're going to really give credit to them when they do that and so on. So their narrative is prevailed. And maybe some of you here think that People's Park should be, you know, that should be taken over by the university and turned into what they're proposing. But there has to be a public debate about that. There has to be a public discussion about that. There isn't. There is no public discussion about that. So that, you know, Harvey Smith and others that are working to try to protect People's Park and keep it as it is, but change it as well, are up against a huge propaganda machine. I mean, the University of California at Berkeley has a Department of Brand Protection. That's its name, to protect the brand. And if you think of Berkeley as a corporate entity, rather than a public university committed to social justice, you begin to get a better idea of how it operates. So one, I call for a reckoning and a public conversation about all these issues. Just stop business as usual. And what does this mean? Because it's profound to begin to think about them and talk about them. And secondly, that indigenous organizations, indigenous people, tribes, native groups have to be at the center of this reckoning. Their land, their ancestors, their cultural artifacts, their history for thousands of years before there was a Berkeley and so on. They have to be at the center of this, not just peripheral, not just a handful of students recruited into the undergraduate program, not just a handful of faculty, beleaguered faculty, a lot like the way it was for the small number of African-American faculty in the 80s. You know, small, beleaguered, having to do everything in the name of Native Americans. Not leave it to that, but to bring in a much larger discussion of the tribes and the political organizations of the tribes in California about what should be done. So I deliberately resisted at the end saying we should do X, Y, and Z, because I don't think it's my place to do that. I'm not ducking it, because if you ask me my ideas, I'll tell you. But I think we have to pay attention to the process of reckoning. And the university has got into uses all the tactics learned by corporations and political think tanks about how you minimize issues, how you make things come out looking rosy for the institution, how you sidetrack things, how you don't deal with big issues, but get them thinking about, my God, Cal's not going to be able to play football competitively, you know. I mean, that's sort of at the top of the list of the critically important things to do. That Cal, pays its football coach higher salary than the highest salary, I think, of any public person in California today, which says a lot about the priorities of the university. I deliberately didn't want to do that because I don't think it's my place to do that. And if people ask me, I'll say, but I think that the process itself has to be looked at, and we have to get away from this corporate process of managing a problem, getting away from the management of a problem to opening it up to the kind of conversation we're beginning to have here. And maybe we could get a range of people's comments, just a few comments at the end.
Okay, right here. Okay. See, the problem is I can't have C, so y'all gonna have to. Yeah. Okay. Oops. See, I told you I can't see. Okay. Has that always been there? Okay. Right here and then over here. Okay, and right over here. Okay. Okay. 1, 2, 3. Okay.
All right.
Okay.
I was one there. I appreciate hearing some of this longer history because I'm a graduate student and so I haven't been here for as many years as many of my faculty colleagues have, and it's interesting to see how much of this stuff just gets regurgitated decade to decade. In my department, for example, the university is protecting Elizabeth Hoover, who is a white woman who has built a career on claiming fraudulent indigenous identity. And the Native American Community Center, Native American Student Development, currently has a building, Anthony Hall, which is essentially leased to them for free by the graduate student body. and the Chancellor's office is refusing to provide Native community center space in a more permanent fashion. So it's just these cycles of sort of colonialism perpetuate, and it's felt a lot like students have done most of the organizing around this and felt a real gap in solidarity from other folks in other positions in the university because of the ways the institution tries to carve people up based on affiliation. So I'm curious to hear a little bit of sort of thinking around solidarity across students, staff, faculty, and ways that work can actually progress, knowing that it's in the university's best interest to keep us from working together.
Can we get into several comments and then I'll
Okay.
Divine?
So 1, 2, 3. Wait, 3. Were you? I'm losing it. Okay. 1, 2, 3, then 4. Okay.
I wonder if you could comment on the age of many of the individuals and ancestors and what collections one thing that has been really shocking to my students when I talk them about or expose them to this dirty little secret of Powell is that these are not in fact, to my understanding, like Paleolithic specimens. They're not 5,000 years old. In fact, I have come across information that some of the human remains that were recklessly dug up and disinterred under the aegis of the anthropology department are as recent as perhaps the 1920s. So these really are ancestors in terms that we can understand, like grandparents, great-grandparents, and I'm really curious what you found in terms of like the age of the individuals in the collection, whether that came up for you.
Okay, and so he's taking down and he's going to respond. Okay, right here.
So I was wondering, with your knowledge, what you think about the what was initially like, oh, the closing of the anthropology library and the protests, the student protests. I see, like, and around the same time, the announcement that there will be a new college of like
Data
computer
science.
and computing and statistics, or I don't know if that's the exact name, but now it seems like maybe the university wants to bury its past, and it's like instead of having a critical view of, like a constructive criticism. And when today's students, like myself, who are interested in studying, people in ethnic studies and gender and women's studies, doing ethnography or autoethnography within their own communities.
Okay. And I think there was one more. Okay, back here. Yeah.
A couple of things. One, first of all, thank you for the work you've done. I wanted to give an possible example of another pushback from way back in the administration was Pete Seeger's dad, who founded the musicology department and then was essentially forced out of university for being too liberal. The other is just, since there's so much important talk about the Native people, I just wanted to share that annually there's a march on, they call it Buy Nothing Day, other people call it Black Friday, the day after Thanksgiving. The Native people host a walk from the Berkeley Shell Mound, which is another threatened site of human remains, to the Emeryville site. And about 500 people came last year.
Okay, well, I think Tony can. Yeah.
I'm going to come back to the solidarity question last, since that seems to be a bigger question here. In terms of the age of people being dug up and being removed and brought back to Berkeley, about how old were the grave sites and so on. So there's a section in the book where I document two things. One is I document how until the federal legislation of 1990, University of California and Berkeley is the main actor of the whole university. There's, Davis and UCLA and so on. Nobody comes close. I mean, it's Berkeley monopolized it, and they wanted to monopolize not just the digging up of graves and bringing human remains back to the campus and building up, you know, 1 million cultural artifacts. That's not rhetorical million. I think it's about 1 million artifacts and so on. But they also saw themselves as being the hegemon of expertise about everything Indian in California. So they wanted everybody to come to them when they had questions about history and the past and languages and culture and graves and all of that. So I mean, Davis and other people did do that, but it's really it's tiny compared to what Berkeley's done. And the other campuses, for the most part, have successfully addressed repatriation and dealt with that. Compared to Berkeley, Berkeley's the only one that's really totally resisted it until this point. So what I found is that until the legislation of 1990, the federal legislation, they are not only going around digging up graves and encouraging people to do it. So I think the last collection of artifacts and human bodies that they got from grave sites, I think was 1988. So it's going on very, very late, and they're you know, in their annual reports and their to the public and to the university and so on, they talk, you know, we got so and so, and students went out, you know, on it to do a dig in Santa Cruz, and they brought back a skull. Thank you very much for donating it to the university and so on. So this was going on in a fairly widespread way until 1990. But what I also found, and I write about this, is I found in the anthropological notes where they were finding native grave sites that were still in use. And they'd say, you know, there's this grave site that we went to it, but there were, you know, people told us that there are still people being buried there and still people visiting it. But if we come back in a year or two, we should be able to get access. So that would be an example of they know that people are being buried. And I think it goes back to this notion of that, you know, whether somebody was buried 100 years ago or 5,000 years ago, it's the same sort of generic Indian that, you know, that we can study. That view is so pervasive, and the racist ideas there permeated because it assumes that, for example, people live pretty extraordinary lives all the way from the hills of Berkeley all the way down to the estuary here. This was a massive flowing body of water. If you were here when the big rains of a couple of years ago, there's a photograph of that in the book. So I got a photograph of the water coming through the campus, just to give a sense of what that waterway was like. The university destroyed that waterway, put it underground, polluted it, put chemicals in it, and so on. They're now talking about resurfacing it in the center of Berkeley, as sort of a architectural part of downtown Berkeley. But this was an extraordinary body of water, and I mean, people were fishing for salmon and trout and clamfish on the Berkeley campus, you know. And then the hills of the hills at the top had all kinds of game, wild game. So this was, you know, we know from the history of tribes and indigenous communities is that when you can take care of your living situation, your water, and your food, then you can have a very, very rich ceremonial life. You've just got a lot more time and energy to put into rituals and culture and so on. So this was no doubt an important ceremonial place. It was also, when Berkeley put out reports on the shell mounds, the village sites throughout the Bay Area, they did everywhere but the Berkeley campus. It was clearly like let's not talk about what actually happened here. So this was going on here in a widespread way. And the thing is that once you think about people being sort of stuck in amber in thousands of years and never changing, then you're not interested in how do people creatively stay in a place and how do they change it? So like the people that lived here 5,000 years ago did X, Y, and Z. So 1,000, 2,000, 3 years ago, what did people do differently? So the assumption was that people didn't adapt and change because they were stuck. They were stuck. That's the fiat lux thing coming back to permeate the scientific knowledge, as opposed to like, well, okay. And then we have one of the things that I was delighted to find is that there was a French explorer, so-called explorer, that came through here in the late 18th century into Northern California. And he said he'd never seen such a fertile, productive piece of land anywhere in Europe like was here. I mean, he was just shocked by how productive it was. You know, the foodstuffs, the availability of everything, the the long and good lives that people had. And he wrote about it. He wrote about it because these people kept very good memoirs and diaries and so on. The anthropology library. Yeah, the anthropology library. I mean, that's a fantastic example of. I mean, it's very hard for the university to tell students, no, you can't have your own library. You know what I mean? The public relations doesn't look good, right? But that took, how many weeks did that struggle take just to keep the library in the anthropology department? You know, it took a while. You know, it took sit-ins and educating people and so on. And the university, I think, didn't want to get into that. Now, what we have not seen comparable is like what it means to do something about what the anthropology department sits on. You know, so the fact that it sits on a basement of thousands and thousands of human remains and tens of thousands of cultural artifacts, and you know, I don't know what you do with buildings like that and places like that. It's like the physics building that had the white supremacists, LeConte brothers, and then it had the physicists that created the atomic bomb. I mean, do you raze it to the ground and build something new? I mean, you know, I think you have to do something pretty consequential to get rid of the ghosts of places like that. But I think we learned from the struggle that took place, that students and staff involved in around protecting the library and the anthropology department, that whenever you do that, you can have success. And I think the best example in some ways of a persistent struggle is getting the university to disinvest in economically in South Africa. That was an incredible struggle. The university invested billions of dollars in apartheid South Africa. And when the movement organized to support the battle against apartheid, people were arrested, people were disciplined, people were expelled. I mean, they cracked down, and the regents voted against, you know, no, we're not going to take our money out of South Africa and so on, and economic development has nothing at all to do with politics, blah, blah, blah. But that movement got incredible support from the political system, from the legislature, from high-level political people, from political organizations. And eventually the university responded and got all their money out of apartheid South Africa. So when Nelson Mandela came here, any of you go to that event in the Oakland Coliseum? Extraordinary event, you know. Amongst other things, he thanked those of us in the Bay Area. He said, thank you for this struggle to, you know, economically disinvest from South Africa. That played a big part in helping to get global attention to apartheid and to push up the apartheid system to end and so on. So that was an extraordinary struggle, and I don't think enough has been written about how they did that, how they organized and how effective they were. Quite remarkable. And so that, you know, in terms of Pete Seeger's dad and the music department, there's all these histories to be written. I mean, there's the untold histories of activists, of progressives involved with Berkeley I mean, I found a few people that I wrote about when I thought they related to what I was writing about, but there's a lot to be investigated there and thought about. And also the contradictory people, like the women that founded the women's faculty club, you know, because they were being kept out of the men's faculty club. Progressive, you know, fighting the sexism of the men that only allowed Phoebe Hearst into the men's faculty club because she was the big donor. Started their own. But those same women then were very deeply involved, several of them, with the eugenics movement in social work and education. You know, talking about cultural and racial differences in intelligence and so on. So, you know, that contradictory history has not been really explored or written about too. There's many other examples like that. And I think, so in some ways it goes back to the zigzag, you know, when you think about the free speech movement, that a lot of the activists in the free speech movement were involved in the struggle for votes in the civil rights struggle, which Waldo knows about and has written about, and made that connections. You read the Mario Savio speeches where he talks about the links between racism in the South and free speech in places like Berkeley, that deep solidarity. My own political history and experience becoming politicized was to think of politics very broadly, not just about one issue. But I think now we've got to do that again. And you know, when I went to school and was a young professor on the Berkeley campus, you left the building, and there were all these different things you could choose to do politically as an activist. It's much harder when you have to build those organizations. So I think we're in a rebuilding time. But I know whenever I talk to students, they want to do stuff. So it's not that people don't want to do things, but you have to build the kinds of organizations to make this happen. And that's, I think, where the solidarity would come, where people see. So for me, I wrote a lot more about militarism in this book than I started off thinking I would write. Helped by the fact that Los Alamos was taking over sacred burial grounds in New Mexico, helped me make that connection. Helped that Los Alamos hired and exploited Pueblo labor, as construction workers and nannies and cooks and so on for Los Alamos. Helped that I began to understand how Native people in New Mexico were made into sort of into entertainment for the families of the physicists that created the atomic bomb. Knowing that, and then knowing also that this was a total shock, finding out that the University of California still administers the Bradley Museum in New Mexico, that is the major museum of the history of Los Alamos, a museum that tells the story of Los Alamos from the viewpoint of the military. University of California administers, they don't run it educationally, but they oversight it and run it administratively today. So finding those connections, I didn't know that I'd find those connections, but then made it easier for me to try to write through a solidarity lens, so that people could see a connection between the atomic bomb, the land occupied by the university, the human remains, Fiat Lux, that these are interconnected, and that I think we need the politics to match that solidarity.
On that wonderful note, I think we should all, and I want to once again thank Victoria, Doug, and everybody who helped to make this possible. And I've been energized. I'm always energized by these kinds of moments. And so I think I might make a beeline to some of that food to up my energy level. But thank you so much. Victoria?
Thank you for being our moderator. Yes, please take the food and garbage as well. Cans are outside.
That was great. Thank you. Yeah, that's great.